Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the small print. Today, our guest is Joshua Gillers. And Joshua, however you want to be called, this is your opportunity to introduce yourself the way you'd like to be introduced. Tell us where in the world you are, what you do, how you describe yourself anyway, and what it is that you're interested in or not.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me on. My name is Josh Gellers, and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of North Florida in sunny Jacksonville, Florida. My research focuses on the intersection between environmental politics, rights, and technology. And so I've been kind of moving in more of our AI and robotics direction as of late. But I also am pretty active in my local community and especially issues of civic engagement, environmental protection. And so I always kind of like to keep my ear to the ground and one foot in the real world while I'm thinking about very abstract problems as well. And I'm really happy to have this conversation with you and look forward to all of our interesting debates and commentary.
Sure. So it's quite a wide mandate or beat that you're covering there. Environment, AI, philosophy, real life citizenship. Now, there's not much that doesn't fit on that quadrant, right? So you're both qualified and incentivized to have an opinion on lots of different topics, I'm assuming, which is why we invited you here. Hopefully you have some.
Yes, more than I think sometimes, but yeah, happy to share my thoughts.
I think I've connected with you on social media for quite a number of years now, but how you popped back on my feed recently was by upsetting the AI ethics community by comparing overhype in the AI ethics sphere with overhype in AI itself. What led you to put that out there? Because I certainly know that running up against the AI ethics community, even in the gentlest sort of way, can give you a swift and fast rebuttal, shall we say, from that rather tight-knit community.
Yeah, it's a real thorn bush. I think part of it is that I view myself both as outside of that mainstream and also kind of part of it. I do have a non-resident expert position with the Global AI Ethics Institute. I deeply care about the discourse around AI ethics and how we are proceeding to talk about the pros and cons of novel technologies. And I think by being on the outside, it gives me a little bit more clarity when I see the discussions moving in a certain direction. And it drives me nuts, quite frankly, to see people not acknowledging that those conversations are happening and they're trending in this particular direction. And so, I mean, you may have seen already, I think I'm blocked by just about every major AI ethicist at this point. And
by the way, if anyone wants to try that game.
I mean, yeah, it's not hard. They don't
Huh.
like discussion. They don't like being challenged about anything. You need to conform to their pre-existing little like Hamlet of ideology and beliefs, which I don't ascribe to. And again, that's because I'm coming from a different perspective. But I have sort of quietly had private conversations with people, DMs, LinkedIn, and so on, where people actually thank me for holding some of these people to task because they personally disagree with the way that they're engaging and talking about important issues. But they don't feel that they themselves can take them to task and share their thoughts without some kind of retribution. So I really feel like I have nothing to lose except for being blocked by a few people. But the people who care actually about the conversation and whether we're allowed to talk about certain things, whether it's fruitful to have these kinds of debates, those are the ones who tend to agree with me. And I'm happy to kind of be the torchbearer for their perspective.
Yeah, I find this a really interesting conversation, but let's take a little step back for people
Sure.
who are not familiar with the discourse or with the weeds of the academic-ish corners of social media, which are strange and bizarre places for normal people who go onto social media to check the sort of the rugby or the cricket score, right? This is a very different sort of subculture world to what most people would be familiar with. Can you explain, people who don't know anything about the topic, what is AI ethics? What even is
Yeah.
that? It's all over the
So
news,
it's
but for a layperson, what is this
sure.
thing?
So if you're familiar with the form of technology of artificial intelligence, AI ethics really refers to the study and practice of how we approach the this kind of technology with our ethical orientations. So that would be scholarship, commentary, the actual way in which programs get developed, the kind of personnel who are in charge of that, the sort of inputs that they have to include when they're developing new technologies. And so it began kind of as a sort of a cognate to computer ethics and later robo-ethics, but it's so largely academic, but it has grown into this very broad field that encompasses also the private sector, government in terms of their interface with artificial intelligence, how we use AI, and whether what we're doing could be considered ethical.
So it's an academic field. It helps with policy. It helps for framing conversation. And I think probably critically to this particular conversation is it's become quite a lucrative field to find yourself in, both whether you are seeking fame or fortune in an academic career, which is rather scarce on both those opportunities. It's one of the few places where you can get your name in the paper and maybe even get some money from government and or the private sector to build a nice career in a very tight market. I don't know if you'd agree with that as someone who's much closer to the subject than I am.
I would 100% agree with that. And in fact, I would add that people who have very little knowledge of artificial intelligence or ethics are making their way into that conversation. Think about Henry Kissinger, right? Having recently worked on this issue before his recent death. There are famous, economists who have never really done any work on technology and all of a sudden are popping up in this space. So everyone sees that there are opportunities here, and there's definitely a lot of intermingling between academia, industry, and government in ways that might make some people very curious or frustrated.
Yeah, and I think this is why the conversation is so interesting to me, because my work sort of straddles economics, foresight, public sector, private sector in my sort of day job, not with this particular show, which I do just for fun. But the point is that a lot of these issues kind of overlay too, because especially in this sort of futures foresight field, very similar to the AI ethics field and these sort of academic topics. Firstly, there are no kind of right or wrong answers. There's a whole lot of guessing and speculation, which already makes it a bit of an outlier in an academic context, right? Because like STEM, even though we can go back to old Russell and all the rest of it and how there's like assumptions and turtles all the way down and there's some flawed assumptions, at least when you're dealing with sort of STEM fields, you're agreeing to a set of assumptions, whether they're flawed or not, and then sort of basing premises upon that can then be tested and verified. Whereas this is a much more open-ended side of academia, which borders on speculation, and for the less charitable, particularly lay people who look at this and go like, what on earth is going on in the ivory towers? Just straight up science fiction. I mean, like the realms stay very, very quickly, very similar. So the AI conversations bump into the features conversations all the time. But what I find interesting, and perhaps that's what we can get into talking about today, is that although these fields are quite open, and although they are empirically no correct answers, because we're dealing with issues of values, with issues of morals, with issues of preferences, and with issues of choices, to which, of course, different people have different ethics, different values, different choices. There's no sort of one-size-fits-all morality when it comes to the future or the future of how we should be dealing with technology. There's very different views there. But at the same time, if you find yourself on the professionalized sphere of this, right, on the sort of pop culture sphere, and there are, of course, many pop culture thought leaders and speakers and LinkedIn AI bloggers, we don't even write their own blog posts anymore, but that's sort of side point, that have opinions all across the political and the ethics and values map. However, if you find yourself in the professionalized academic circle of these sorts of fields, you very soon find yourself being forced to adopt the correct view, which is quite ironic. It's like the whole study of ethics, the whole study of philosophy, the whole study of futures is all about open-ended conversations and about broadening perspectives rather than narrowing them. But at the same time, when you deal with professionals, and particularly professional academics working in this space, you learn very quickly what is the right answer and what is the wrong answer, and whether you are on the right side or the wrong side, not of the history, but of the future, which is quite interesting to me. Like as much as we try to do scenarios about the future, we all know what the right scenario is when it comes to climate change, when it comes to government, when it comes to universal basic income, when it comes to AI. You know which answers you have to check if you want to be considered a legitimate professional in the field. Would you disagree with that? I mean, I know I'm not a total insider on this, but I've bumped into various corners of these debates.
No, I think you're right that there's kind of a dominant narrative, and that deviations from that are not really welcome. And so you see what happens when there are these spats among academics or people who are commenting on this. The people who are the most famous in the field kind of dictate to everyone below what the right way is to think about these things. And then they have this army of sycophants that simply, jump all over anyone who disputes, disagrees with, or otherwise dismisses the dominant perspective. And, I was really amazing because to kind of crystallize this experience, one time I was challenging one of the probably most well-known people in the AI ethics world, if you follow, Time Magazine and all those things. And someone said something to the effect of, well, they have so many followers. And so that was a way of legitimizing their perspective. And this was, by the way, coming from a PhD student at Princeton. And their argument wasn't look at the internal coherence of their perspective, look at the sort of the moral values and how laudable they are. What they said was that this person, the reason why their perspective is valid and maybe better than others is because they have a large following. So that shows you just how sort of disconnected the idea is from its merit. And again, by being somewhat of an outsider as a political scientist, I don't feel at all beholden to whatever the mainstream people or the top people think about these perspectives. And so I find that liberating in a way, but I can also see how it has kind of infected a lot of the discourse around some of the hot button issues involving AI, where dissent is really not tolerated. And what happens is you will have people sort of violently attack you because you disagree with the main or dominant narrative, when you're just disputing it, challenging it. And I think that just like in your career, there should be that space to have these kinds of engagements. It's not tolerated. It's not allowed. And so what it happens is people shut down those conversations, and we wind up just with the ones at the top dictating everything to everyone else. So I think that that's really unhealthy as a matter of civic discourse, and ultimately counterproductive, because some of what those people are even arguing is internally incoherent with their own belief system, as I've argued. So it's a mess, and I don't know a way to make it better, but I think maybe having these kinds of one-on-one conversations and illuminating these problems is a step in the right direction.
Now, just go back to your point that you made there. You say like those at the top. Now, are you talking about those at the top of the hierarchy, or are you talking about those who have the most media or airtime, the sort of celebrities that have emerged in this field? Because AI in particular is such a sexy topic at the moment. It is the topic that journalists want to write about. It's the topic that politicians want to build their careers and election campaigns around. It's the topic that individual human beings want to debate around the coffee table or the water cooler in order to sort of build their own social credit. What do you mean by people at the top of the conversation? How do they get there? And how are these sorts of self-reinforcing patterns, these Matthew effects, affecting academia, which is always supposed to be, in some ways, as much as we talk about academia being a rarefied ivory tower type industry, there's kind of a reason for that. There's a reason that we gave professors tenure. There's a reason why we have the cliche of the lonesome, the much more sort of anti-social academic working by themselves among piles of papers. There's such a common trope or stereotype within novels or within popular culture. There's kind of a reason for protecting and isolating those who are thinking on the fringes, giving people not just financial space, but also fandom space to create real knowledge or to explore ideas without the undue influence of the sort of the media hype cycle that just does force you, if you do want to become a main character on social media, you have to pander to the crowd. It's not something I'm particularly good at, like they say, you spoke about cheese last week, give us more cheese, and you're like, no, I don't want to talk about cheese today, I'm done with that topic. No, we want the cheese. But yeah, just talk to you a little bit about the celebrity and the who's on top at the moment, and whether it is about credentials and bureaucracy, or if it is more about a sort of hype cycle, and if so, sort of what are the dynamics you see there?
So great question. There are some people who have kind of moved between academia and industry who are viewed as sort of the quintessential thought leaders in this space. I mean, I'll give you two examples: Timnit Gebru and Frank Pasquale, both people who I've disagreed with vehemently, both people who are generally not interested in having these kinds of open discussions. And, I think to your previous question, they say the right things, which kind of activate this whole base of people who sort of look to them for answers, and then shut down conversation that in some way detracts from what they say or challenges what they say. And I think there's this kind of vicious cycle, to your point, that has emerged where they say the right things to the base grows larger, continues to hype them up. They're viewed as sort of sacrosanct and the arbiters of truth in the field. And then anyone who contradicts them is instantly viewed as a pariah, never mind the fact that that's not an indictment on the actual, the success or the validity of their arguments. It's really just that, how dare you go up against these people who are viewed as kind of the vanguard of AI ethics? And that's not how academia should, go on. And just as one example of this, there was a paper that Frank Pasquale was on a couple of years ago at a We Robot conference. And it was essentially a hit piece on my 2020 book, Rights for Robots. And I signed up for this conference just to go to that session where they were talking about that paper, and I think that paper only, so I could ask questions to the authors and have a chance to defend myself. Because, like some of the people I've talked to about this say, really the only way that you can have the productive conversation where you do challenge them is in publishing. So publishing becomes really the only forum. Maybe this is another forum, but obviously people like Frank aren't here, where these kinds of conversations can take place, and we can actively play with, toy with, challenge, disrupt, contest those sorts of ideas. Because otherwise, if you try to do it online, you just get blocked, shut down, reported. I mean, I had someone report me because they said I was bullying someone online, and what I was doing was defending my work, which was being criticized by the other person. So that's kind of where we are, that is viewed as bullying. And in part, it has to do with demographics, has to do with positionality. And so if someone is attacking my research publicly, basically they're saying you don't have a right to approach that person and defend yourself, which I think is completely wrong and against the principles of civic discourse.
Yeah, there's a subtlety there in terms of including the public in debates about the public, right? And having like sort of open discourse, but also having protected spaces where professionals can, battle out those ideas within a sort of with sort of some sort of rules of debate. But I think there's another point to be made there in terms of the public sphere, and particularly the battle for ideas in the social media playground, the social media sandbox. In that, those characters that you've described, the people who do become celebrities, who do become thought leaders in public discourse, whether they come from industry or academia, also then by accepting essentially the mantle of fame and the position of celebrity, they also take on like a bit of a Faustian bargain there. I think a great example there is J.K. Rowling, and what happened there is that you become kind of beholden to your fan base, and you have, even if it's not something you've consciously taken on, you end up signing a contract essentially to give the fan base more of what they want. So it makes it very difficult for you to change your opinion. And it also makes it very difficult for you to have different opinions to your fan base. I mean, like J.K. Rowling's famously, let them go to great criticism, or has allowed that wound to develop. She has not continued along the path of that reciprocity of what the people think you should say and what you do say. But it is such a temptation. It's such a trap. And it's something that anyone that's had any little bit of clout on social media, whether you want to admit it or not, it is a real phenomenon. And I'm sure you've experienced it yourself. It's such a temptation just to give the people more of what they want, because that gives you more of what you need, which is a platform to get your ideas across, which is, or to fulfill all those sort of base social and human desires that you have. But it creates perverse incentives, particularly when you are in a position of power to influence. And these people are in a position of power. You yourself are also in a position of power. Even me, I've got a little platform, but still you've got this power to speak truth to power, right? And when that becomes tainted, not by ethics or by academic standards, and it becomes tainted by social pressure. I don't know if that's something that academia has had to grapple with before. Ironically, those of us who've worked more in the private sector, we've had to grapple with this for a lot longer, because a lot of us that do make our money on the speaking circuit, for example, we know, if you have to be popular in order to get work, but you also can't be too popular or you don't keep on getting it. But that's something academia has been protected from previously. But social media has opened up this awful temptation, particularly for the academic classes, that I just don't know that individuals are equipped to deal with. And that's not like a personal criticism. It's more of just this is what happens. It's what happens when a teenage girl goes from being ugly to being beautiful overnight. Like, you don't really know how to deal with that new sort of set of social expectations, that new degree of attention. I don't know if you can speak to that at all, but I just find this a really interesting point, particularly in the celebrity culture of academics, much like the celebrity culture of chefs we've thankfully kind of put behind us. But all these sort of fringe industries that have now sort of been thrown into the reality complex that is a society these days.
Yeah, I think you're right. However, what I will say is that right now is a terrific inflection point because of how, I mean, as a political scientist, people are certainly commenting on this, but also you've seen a lot from the AI ethics community for very different reasons. And so I have witnessed the same dynamic play out, and maybe this is the opportunity where we actually invite a conversation about this, and that is the Israel-Hamas conflict. And so I'll give you one concrete example that all of, I call them stochastic parrot heads, sort of, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but the people who wrote that very famous paper have been largely speaking in unison about, condemning Israel and being pro-Palestine. Timnit Gebru, in fact, wrote or was asked to comment on this piece for VentureBeat and said, I'm done. I'm not engaging. I'm focusing all my energy on being pro-Palestine and all that stuff. And then one of the people in that group of authors, Mel Mitchell, wrote what I thought was actually a very thoughtful, middle-of-the-road, reasonable tweet talking about, hey, this is humanity we're talking about. And it is both terrible that people are dying on the Israeli side, and it is equally as terrible that there are Palestinians who are being forced from their homes and dying as well at the hands of the IDF. And everyone apparently jumped down her throat, and I think she has since deleted that tweet because it didn't fit the narrative of the other people that she was supposed to be towing that line. And yet, when you see, especially like the Israeli AI ethics community, they're like, oh, she was kind of like actually bringing us to a place of openness, and where we feel like we could dialogue with that aspect of the AI ethics community, where they were in fact allowing us to accept the humanity of the victims of October 7th. But all the other ones, like some of the major figures in there, were sort of unabashedly pro-Palestinian and couldn't even bring themselves to acknowledge the deaths that had occurred as a result of the terror attacks from Hamas. That is not to say that what is happening to the Palestinian people isn't bad in its own right. But if you follow the sort of timeline and the feed and everything, not once could they bring themselves to actually admit that. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, where they have to sort of toe this particular line. They've got to repeat this particular narrative because they've got to fit the image that their fans have of them. And as soon as one person deviates from it, she's shut down. And I think that tells us a lot.
Yeah, I mean, as a South African, British, very Gentile person myself, I have absolutely no dog in the fight in that particular area. And that's been a useful perspective to compare what's happened in Gaza with quite a lot of the other binary ethics debates that we've had across all the various different sort of color revolutions, whatever you want to kind of call them, across the globe over the last few years. And that it's a lot harder to have distance when you have been cast by your gender, by your race already into one group and a lot of the other conflicts. This one is interesting because I'm permitted, not through my own sort of, choices or my own virtue or whatever, some degree of distance, and to say that it becomes a useful metaphor for talking about how we try and make ethical issues very binary. And not only very binary, it becomes more difficult when you talk about how they become packaged in very contradictory ways. And you mentioned this before in terms of like the internal contradictions of people's own ethics and theory. And we can get into that a little bit more later. But this idea of, if you're a good guy, if you're an ethicist, you will support this country in this war, you'll support that country in that war, you will choose this side in that debate, you will choose this side in that topic, and you have to do all of them. You have to buy the whole party pack. There's no swapsies, there's no menu alterations on the set menu. You take all the things if you want to be the good guy. And I think that when you see prominent people in the ethics and the philosophy sort of environment taking very binary, non-nuanced views on very complicated, very messy subjects, that there's clearly not only good guys or bad guys involved in these sorts of messy, wicked, very real human problems, which is basically all the problems that we have. It does kind of make you question, as a layperson, or again, as someone that doesn't actually have a right to comment on any of these sorts of things, whether that ethics professional, that ethics celebrity's views on topics as banal as AI, because let's face it, that's a much more theoretical problem than the sort of problems of life and death that people are suffering with already here in the present. It does make you kind of question whether, if you're not able to remove biases or particular points of view from your judgments on certain issues, can you do that for other issues too, right? And I think that this sort of brings kind of to the crux of the conversation that I wanted to have with you today. So I just wanted to ask the question right outright: why are AI ethics people so anti-AI? And I saw a very similar thing happen here with the whole sort of blockchain and crypto space. Incidentally, a lot of people who were crypto ethicists like 3 years ago are now AI ethicists. And on the crypto side, I was able to answer very authoritatively when they were making just plainly wrong assumptions. I actually do know quite a lot about how crypto works on a technical basis and on a functional basis. I was quite involved in a few startups in the very early days there. So I kind of had a perspective to say, I know what's going on here. I know that you're missing a whole lot of nuance here. And there was no kind of humility to say, actually, maybe we need to figure this out. Ironically now, sort of fast forward sort of 3 to 7 years into the future, depending on how sort of late to the party the ethics community was there, suddenly all these tools are being seen as tools because now the EU is using them for digital identity rather than a corporate using them to sort of, shill NFTs. But it's like the technology itself is still the same thing, but they're able to sort of swing around because now the party is moved in a different direction. And I do tend to think or feel that very similar things are happening in the AI space, that AI is bad because crypto was bad, but crypto can now be useful because good guys are using it, good guys TM are using it. And AI is bad now at the moment. There's no redeeming qualities if you look to the AI ethics community for this at all. And people that are pro AI are accelerationist, capitalist mercenaries, bad people, and good people are like full on team brake rather than team accelerator, even enough to go forward at this point. Why is that? How can you be an ethicist or an academic philosopher around a topic if you've already decided whether it is good or bad going out the gate? I don't know. Maybe I don't know about how academics work.
No. I think, the long and short of it is you can't be a very good one or a very trustworthy one, to use an AI word, if you have made those kinds of sweeping assumptions without really delving into some of the more challenging and gray areas of or ethical problems associated with it. So I would agree with you that there is this sort of polarization or bifurcation where you have to kind of choose to be on one team or the other. It's interesting to me too. I mean, gosh, it seems like such excessive navel gazing. If it makes an academic blush to see, before the conflict in Gaza, basically all the AI ethics people had jumped onto what they call test realism, right? And so people who are in, the accelerationists, there was this issue.
What a strange collection. I mean, the test realists,
yeah,
don't talk to each other. I know all those communities. They
right. So it could be a very injudicious lumping together of a bunch of disparate communities that all have something to say about technology, broadly construed. But it has become this sort of, large one-wheely term, if you will, to describe all these different communities. I admittedly know very little about the communities, having only been introduced to them sort of very tangentially through my own work. I'm certainly not an adherent to any of them, but what I find curious, to your point, is that there's this one camp which has decided all of them are all wrong, and then there's this other side which have decided all the AI ethicists are wrong, and they don't have any space for actually a kind of really what would be probably really fascinating public debate or something about, should we, which there was briefly, but just among the AI ethicists, should we pause AI development until we can sort of figure out what we're doing, or should we, move fast and break things because, the sort of techno-optimists think that we're going to solve all of the world's problems in a day if we just allow big tech to do whatever it wants. There's got to be a middle ground there somewhere, but I think it's important.
Seatbelts and speed limits, we could look at those things and still keep it calm. Right. But
so I think there's an opportunity to have a conversation about what sorts of strategies might we want to employ And then God, right before all this stuff happened with Gaza, it was like the Sam Altman Chronicles and everything that's happened around that. And it slightly touched on that test realism thread, but then was sort of overshadowed by everything else, which also kind of gives you a sense of the pre-existing ideological commitments of the people who are part of this conversation, where even if they had ostensibly no knowledge of what's going on in that part of the world, they knew that they had to be on one side of it. They had to choose their sort of morally clear version of what was the right position to take. And so, yeah, I think it's maddening, but it's also, in a way, I'm taking a little bit of a breath, because I feel like, well, at least we're not just talking about this excessive navel gazing between people who think that, like the sort of Nick Bostrom's of the world versus some of the top AI ethicists who are like, all AI is bad and basically it's just a vehicle for bias and discrimination. And then the other people are saying, well, we should let Elon Musk download our brain and then sell it back to us. Like, there's got to be a middle ground somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. But is that middle ground what is being debated, or do people in the space, particularly in the academic space, do they see themselves essentially as traffic wardens or like traffic police whose job it is to be against developers in the private sector rather than being kind of parallel and with them? Is there, because I mean, like, I read all these articles and I find them so fascinating, especially like the recent one that came out last week complaining about how not enough women in AI had been acknowledged as being AI, and then like the only list of women that the journalists are able to provide to back up that claim is all AI ethicists in AI, and not a single woman who's on the development side. And like, why are we kind of forcing this into like warring camps? Why isn't it about sort of working together? Like, how do we not move fast and break things, but how do we move forward and build things? Like, why has it been set up in such a way as to be confrontational rather than collaborative, like academia and industry here? Because it's such a natural point of collaboration as far as I can see, right? I mean, most of the ideas are coming out of academia and then being developed in industry, and then there should be a much more friendly loop. But why is it that it's so naturally seems in this particular case to have separated into these different fields? And then you get the question of AI alignment. As much as you try and want to align AI towards human ideals, but humans are so unaligned on this issue. Like, how the hell do you think you're going to align AI when we can't even like talk to each other across the room, right? Like, the conversations are just so different. And the conversations even around this sort of test real, as you say, community and the academia sort of community have sort of positioned themselves quite in opposition to that, is that they're not even having the same conversation, let alone having a conversation about what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. Like, the ethics community has just decided to ignore all of the conversations taking place on the technologist test reel, if you want to sort of combine them into that group sort of realm, and focus only on issues, on very pedestrian issues of bias and data capture and current harms. There's like no willingness to talk about longer term possibilities, although there are possibilities. At the same time, sort of academics or the practitioner side, the builders and accelerationists, also just not interested to talk about pedestrian, mundane, day-to-day, current, present issues at all. It's like, how can you even begin to do anything other than just prop up everybody's clear incentive to spend as much time in the media, in the headlines, as the main character of the day as possible? Because I'm just like, I don't know how you resolve this at this point.
I don't think you can. I think that academics, journalists, practitioners are all captured by the sort of perverse dynamics of social media, which create the conditions that facilitate polarization and then the feedback loops which lead to more of that. So instead of having, broaching these kinds of disputes, people coming together, for like an Oxford debate or something like that, they're people making their careers literally off of focusing on the other side or completely ignoring the other side, which could be really important for ethical reasons and policy reasons. And there's one thing which, I'll push back on a little bit, which is actually it's some of the AI ethicists who I've criticized in the past for being very chummy with industry and not acknowledging that they do actually have a kind of interest here. The same people who are saying, businesses are, only, like, just to give one example from my neck of the woods on the robot rights issue, the only reason we would do this is because businesses want to shield themselves from liability. The person who makes that very argument is working for a tech company. So don't lecture me on, who's going to be in bed with whom because of their financial prerogatives, when you're actually closer right now to the big tech sector than you are the sort of allegedly, independent, autonomous academic circles. So there's a lot of that going on too. They're sort of speaking out of both sides of their mouth, but it's the toxic dynamics of online discourse that lead to this bifurcation where you're either, someone who's only concerned with, humans in the year 2099 and making sure that our robotic appendages are functioning appropriately so we can live for another 1,000 years, and people who are focused only on how AI might impact people in some certain subsets of communities, and everyone else who is not focused on that issue is immoral.
Yeah,
where where does the middle ground lie? And I again, to your point, at present, I don't think that those people are willing, because of the incentive structure, to have a rapprochement and to have a conversation with each other.
Well, let's interrogate that incentive structure a bit, because you're absolutely right. I can't help but have noticed the career trajectories of some of the more prominent voices in the space, who have started in academia, got a bit of following on social media, ended up being hired by a well-known tech company, happy to take their money for a few years for the first contract, and then say something that is obviously going to harm shareholder value, and then act completely shocked that they are now being censured by the shareholders whose value they have just disrupted, and then leave under a large media storm and manage to set up a new career in an NGO space or in a funded research and development department attached to some university. It seems to be a nice shortcut to accelerate, getting towards the lab that you want to build. That's a very cynical view, but it seems to be quite a very incentivized path to both eat the poison apple and then be able to still maintain the sort of moral high ground, right? Which is quite incredible. But I don't know how you sort of fix these incentives, because the money does talk, right? And there are much bigger paychecks to be found in the private sector than they are in research departments, unless they are being funded by extraordinary grants and public noise, which is a one way to do it. And the funding just doesn't make sense in that regard. Like, how are we going to incentivize people who are working on the ethics and philosophy side of things in such a way that they're not automatically set up as being enemies of the private sector who's making a whole lot more money than they are, which is, I think, at the core a big rift across the incentives and also across the sort of the motivations for polarization here. You're not naturally inclined to be super enthusiastic and friendly towards someone who's making an awful lot more money than you are, although they're working adjacent to you. But
so what I will say is, I don't think that you will dissuade the likely grifters. They realize the value of spinning the webs that they're spinning, and that they can monetize that in some way. And they probably have a book agent and a speaking agent and all these things kind of lined up. But what I will say is that some of the folks that I have had the pleasure of interacting with in the AI ethics community, or maybe just sort of philosophy in general, are really just interested in the questions. And I am really drawn to some of that literature because they approach it from such a kind of innocent and curious perspective, where they allow room for many different possibilities and are willing to be wrong, which is also really important. And so I am heartened by the community of people who are doing it for the knowledge sake, to kind of push our thinking about ethics in new, interesting, and challenging directions. And I don't look to the celebrated AI ethicists for any kind of actual thought leadership, because to me, they're compromised.
That is such an important point, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is very unfair to judge the whole sector based on its most prominent, most famous, most front page voices, and yet that's exactly what I've spent this whole conversation doing. But we've spent it doing that because, like we framed this conversation at the beginning, was that when it comes to essentially careers and fields that are designed to shape the future, whether it's through policy or through narrative, the loudest voice in the biggest story has the biggest impact. And that's kind of a tragedy that you and I kind of have to grapple with. As much as you're interested in people asking the interesting questions, writing interesting papers, having interesting conversations, they're not the ones that are being heard. And this is one of those sort of great unfair things when it comes to narrative-based nudging of the future. And that is the most prevalent story wins. Whether you're taking something as banal as trend reports that say that we're going to be eating more locusts next year, the very fact that someone wrote a trend report that says that makes some brand manager in some stupid department store more likely to want to buy the locusts from their local hipster locust dealer, right? You know, like the stories change expectations, which change behavior. And those louder voices are going to get more column inches. And because that's the way the media hype cycle works, attention begets attention. And simple ideas crowd out more complicated ideas because they're harder to sell, they're harder to package, they're certainly harder to package into a tweet length format to sort of send out to everyone. So that's another sort of challenge there. So I know that the small things we can do is have conversations like this and actually amplify and highlight interesting voices and conversations and not fall into the trap of just giving more negative or positive feedback to the same people who are in the space. But are there any other things we can be doing within academic organizations, within the private sector, within the public sector? What if you got to be sort of, you know, benevolent dictator of the universe for a day or two? How could we start to reshape those systems? We have slightly better incentives, and so we give more space to fringe ideas rather than mainstream ideas. And this is something, particularly in the AI conversation, is exactly what we've got to be thinking about, because everything to do with our AI future is all about pushing everything to the middle. It's all about Matthew effects. It's all about consensus views and simplest answer rather than variety and choice. That's the big difference between the search engine sort of way of thinking of the world and the AI way of thinking of the world. And it's interesting that it's kind of reflected in the human dynamics around the sector too. But these are great examples. You've got one or two or three voices that sort of dominate the conversation, and they're going to continue doing that. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts? Any suggestions?
I mean, we have done. I'll take one example. You know, we had a gentleman at my university who was the director of our interfaith center, and he had such a great way of bringing different religions together to kind of explore the differences. Some of the, obviously right now it's a pretty, you know, hotbed kind of issue, especially when you're thinking about Islam and Judaism. But I have been in some of these types of spaces where there's a really thoughtful person who is respected across the board, who's able to lead. And I think we need to maybe find a way to create more of those types of leaders who are able to facilitate those conversations, and not just having the forum for them, but people who will command the respect, and people will believe that they are earnest when they say, I want these groups to talk to each other. Again, sort of on the heels of the Gaza conflict, one example of this from grad school was an initiative when I was in grad school called the Olive Tree Initiative. And the whole point of it initially was to get Jewish, Muslim, Christian, and non-denominational kids, bring them over to Israel, and they all learn from talking to people on different sides of the conflict and with each other. And people come back, and it's been such a transformational experience for them, where they realize that they're humanizing the people that they maybe only heard about. They're learning from firsthand experience the concerns, the real lived experiences, and so on. And it's led by people who are genuinely interested in facilitating those kinds of dialogues. So I think we need almost like a leadership training camp where we deputize people to go out into their respective worlds. It could be industry, it could be, you know, something like sectors of academia, it could be you know, local government, whatever it might be, but building spaces to have difficult conversations where everyone buys in from the get-go that this person is coming at this as a dispassionate sort of facilitator and someone who is going to bring out the best in us. And so it's sort of, in a way, is helping to realize like the John Stuart Millian dream of, you know, hearing both perspectives, because you can't really have a good or formulate a good opposing perspective if you don't know what the opposition thinks. But we need a way to do that where people are not going to jump down each other's throats and are going to be willing to listen. I don't know if that's going to solve all of our problems, but I feel like that's part of the issue, is that this kind of discourse is happening in the worst possible area, which is social media, where all the incentives are completely misaligned with what we're trying to achieve, which is greater harmony, greater peace, greater understanding. So I think these things actually need to probably happen offline. They need to maybe start small, and we need people who are going to command the respect of the people in the room who will believe that that person has their best interests at heart.
That's true. And there's also got to be that other point that if you are going to be essentially a critic of an industry, for better or for worse, so sort of determining what they're doing wrong and right, you actually have to understand what that industry is doing. And that means that you have to be on friendly terms with them. Because if you are on antagonistic terms with the industry that your job is to understand, you're really not going to have the biggest picture. And again, I can draw from experience in the crypto and blockchain space, how people were very confidently critiquing things they didn't understand at all, because no one had been prepared to explain to them what was really happening or how the technology works on a very sort of like a very positive level, never mind a normative level. Like they clearly had massive gaps in their understanding, if we're talking very confidently from ethics and critics kind of perspective, because they had not been able to get together. And that obviously doesn't have positive implications for anyone's work, right? It's not helpful to society at large, and it's really not helpful to that person's own career and credibility when the rest of the world does kind of catch up and understand what was going on at the technological level, never mind sort of ethical level. But like you have to have that sort of base level of understanding. And I suppose I'm kind of concerned that a lot of the distance between the theoretical and the practical side of a lot of technologies, when they are so divided, there's no sort of even point to having these conversations. I read an article on what's going on with COPE at the moment, like in Dubai, and just it was an article that basically printed like an exchange between one of the Saudis and between one of the sort of the more sort of environmental activists that was attending the conference. And it was so clear through that exchange of words that there was no common ground, that there was no common sense of reality even with which to start a debate around, right? Like you have to agree on at least some facts before you can start debating the merits of those facts, right? You have to agree on what is positively correct and what's positively happening before you can possibly hope to debate normative values around that. And I think we are just so far away from that first point, but we're very confidently jumping into the second point, right? Like just absolutely.
So I think I do actually have one thing which I've used in class before, which I think is very helpful. It's called Incompletely Theorized Agreements, and it's probably a pretty marginal paper in his otherwise impressive body of work by Cass Sunstein. And what it really does is it says, okay, every issue has kind of layers to it, and those layers are different levels of abstraction. So how can we get different sides to realize that maybe they do share something in common when you go up to a higher level of abstraction, right? So, and I've just used this as an example because this is what I talk about in class, even though I teach on environmental politics and international relations. But an issue that's so polarizing and divisive like abortion, you can bring pro-choice advocates and anti-abortion activists in the same room and say, okay, we know that you disagree about some very fundamental things, but what about if we started here, that life is important and that murder is wrong? And then you might get probably most people in the room to say, okay, and by having them realize that they do share some common ground, you can then isolate where the disagreements are. And even if they continue to disagree, they will walk out of that knowing that they do have something that they can grapple onto that unites them. And I think that's what we're missing. Yeah.
For constructive conversation. Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. It's a great point across a lot of the weird, impossible conversations that we have in this world today, all these things that we're not allowed to talk about in like public or even in privates without risking your reputation and your ability to earn income for the rest of your life. Such as we like to say, we live in sort of a free speech society. Like even if the government's not going to punish us for saying naughty things, your friends and foes most certainly will. But that's also just a useful tip for life in general. Sort of find something that we can agree on. Like it's what's the time? What's the date? Let's start there, then move forward. Because I'm just absolutely amazed at the absolute disconnect in these conversations, how we're having entirely different conversations about entirely different things, but everybody's very confidently talking at each other. And I know we spend most of the time talking about the ethics and academic side, but we can make all these same points. And in theory, around the tech side too. I mean, like the Mark Andreessen letters and such are just so easy to critique that they almost are satire, right? You can't believe that someone ingenuously sat down and wrote that letter. Like I have to believe that he knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it to get all the usual suspects angry in all the usual ways, right? And he's probably having a good laugh about it. I mean, I do take a very cynical view of all these sides there. At the same time, I think a lot of the op-eds that come out of the ethics community, they know just how limited they are being in their perspective, and they probably also have a good giggle about it later after they've collected their paychecks from their latest speaking circuit gigs, and off we go, right? Because but I think it's good to have these conversations instead of drag those sort of naked emperors into the middle of the room, and there certainly are plenty of them in this space. And with AI, the stakes are so high, but they're also so low, you know, because so much of it is really speculative. And I think that you know, we kind of have to be talking about the right sort of conversations. We also have to put ourselves in perspective into everything else going on in the world. Like you said, Gaza, I mean, Ukraine's still going on. Like we forgot about that because Mark Andreessen was more interesting last week with his letter, right? I mean, we're such a strange species. Like that's the sort of meta conversation around this whole thing.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that you know, unfortunately, I would agree that a lot of the conversations we have tend to occur in parallel, and you have to choose a side. It's just sort of tribalism on steroids online, and it's unproductive. And, you know, to be, you know, completely transparent, you know, I've certainly not been the paradigm of even-handedness online. And probably right before we went on, I probably tweeted something incendiary, but with a purpose. Usually what I'm doing is trying to highlight the hypocrisy in someone's perspective. That's, you could probably file 99% of my online activity into that category. And I hope that through that kind of snarky approach that people at least illuminates, you know, some light bulbs in some brain somewhere that, oh, maybe that person that I have entrusted with viewing or providing me with my perspective, maybe they don't have a monopoly on the truth. Maybe they're not completely right about that issue because they're not thinking about it in a more complex way, which we criticize people for all the time in different aspects, whether it's climate change, abortion, or something like that. But, you know, I think complexity is messy. Human brains like things to be more orderly, and it sort of naturally leads into this sort of, you know, balkanization intellectually and otherwise.
Yeah.
You know, but it's ultimately non-productive. It's kind of like a vehicle for grift, which you have basically been talking about. And which I criticized someone for this very morning who was talking about sort of the school choice movement in the United States. And, you know, a lot of these people, like there's these ulterior motives which are never fully disclosed. And I think whether you are on one side or the other of these debates, that actually would be a very powerful thing that you had to start with when you are talking about your perspective. We have to do this in our academic articles. You have to, you know, explain if there are any conflicts of interest, who your funding sources are. Imagine if that was what you had to do when you were online. That level of radical transparency might shed a lot more light on people's perspectives and why they hold them.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can get behind that sort of like doxing of people's personal lives and all the rest of it, but I understand exactly where you're coming from in terms of the hypocrisy field. But I think to sort of kind of wrap this up, I think I still am confounded as to why we can't have technology with ethics, or ethicists for technology, right? Ethicists who actually like the stuff. I don't think there's any reason why we kind of can't mix those four corners up a little bit more. And I'd certainly like to see more of that. I know your work is quite challenging in that space. And I think it's particularly challenging for people who have fought hard to build their careers in this space, but then have been kind of forced into taking sides and sitting on a corner. I always go back to David Gunkel's map in terms of where people sit in terms of AI and like where their incentives all are and how they align with the map and the dispersion, which yields some pretty interesting insights and kind of backs up your thesis there. But I think we do have a problem. The problem is we've got bad incentives on all sides, but the other problem is that we've also got some bad will in some corners. And that if we want to be more productive, we have to look below the celebrity level. That quite frankly, the celebrity conversations, whether it's the Mark Andreessen and his you know, bombastic sort of, op-eds that he puts out into the ether, or whether it is likewise celebrity ethicists who say exactly what people expect them to say on stages and get very well compensated for it. We need to kind of look below that to what actual people are building and doing, which is quite exciting on the tech side, and what more interesting philosophers and ethicists are writing and questioning and challenging their peers in the corners. And we should perhaps listen to them a bit more. It's a lot more interesting. It's certainly a lot more fun than sort of regurgitating the same old ideas and perspectives over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, just on the academic front, the people whose ideas that I look to challenge my own views are not the ones who are the celebrities. Their ideas are, childishly easy to disentangle and to prove that they're wrong in some way, like, or sort of hopelessly biased. I am always really encouraged when I read something and I think, oh, that really holds my feet to the flame, and it demonstrates that maybe there is a little bit of a weakness in my argument. How would I then address that criticism? And in my experience, and I was very fortunate one time at a human rights conference, someone came up to me afterward and said, "You seem like you just do nothing but reading," which is not true, by the way, but I read a lot and I read widely. And I think that, kind of interdisciplinary reading gives me a much better perspective on how different kinds of disciplines, different groups of scholars, different, disciplines, different areas would conceive of the same issues from these differing perspectives. And it makes me a better scholar. So when I'm looking to how to kind of reinvigorate my own writing, I never look at those people that we're sort of alluding to. I look to the people who are not necessarily promoting their own work, but wrote something. In fact, this happened not too long ago. They wrote something similar to what I did in my book in 2020, but 2 years before I ever did it. And it was very similar. And I wrote them and I was just like, how did I not come across this? This is so great. And then I could see how they approached it from a slightly different direction. To me, that is where the insight, the inspiration comes from in academia, is finding the hidden gems. I don't rely on the celebrities who are going to say the same kind of thing all the time. And in fact, I think not that I've said this here, but the hit piece on my book that was presented at We Robot, I've sent it to colleagues. I've sent it to Gary Marcus. I said, this is the single worst thing I have ever read on robot rights. And my students who don't know a lot about it could write something more balanced and better than this. So because it was so bad, I was like, how is it possible that these very smart people wrote something this bad? And to kind of put a coda on this, when I approached one of the authors at We Robot, this was a virtual meeting, I said, what was the ethical perspective that you used while writing this piece? What is the kind of anchor that you used to sort of criticize, in this case, my book? And they said, we didn't have one. That's the problem. They didn't think. They just wanted to destroy something. And it was so evident from their writing that they weren't doing a good job of it because they had nothing. They were just sort of, speaking out into the void because they didn't like what I had to say. So that to me said everything. And I thought, this speaks volumes, even though they didn't really speak loudly at all. And that, by the way, they said that no one can cite that piece. And I think that's also very telling because they're probably ashamed at how bad it is. So I think look for the people that aren't promoting their work, find those hidden gems. Don't be afraid to speak to them. I recently finished a book on the biography of Cornelius Vanderbilt. I had a criticism of it from TJ Stiles is the author. And I wrote this email to him and I said, hey, I just want to let you know, I really enjoyed this. But at the same time, I think that you might have been wrong about this, with all due respect. His response was so welcoming, humble, accepting. Like that's the kind of, I think, dialogue that we really need to work more on facilitating.
That's the whole point of how the academic process is supposed to work anyway, right? It's supposed to be about peers challenging peers and building upon ideas rather than ad hominem attacks, which is kind of what basically a lot of this is boiled down to, because we're no longer debating issues, we're debating personalities. And so often I go to conferences and people talk about the future and AI and people are condemning ideas based on who said them, whether it is Musk they don't like, or whether it is Mark Andreessen, who can be obnoxious, let's all admit that, or whoever it is. And on the other side too, they'll mention a name of some speaker they saw and didn't like, and that's why that idea is sort of chucked out along with it. But that's what academia is always supposed to be different to media, which is obviously runs on celebrity and headlines and very different things. I think that we probably made a mistake in society in general, something I've spoken about quite a lot, in conflating the different branches, not of government, but the branches of sort of social power.
Mhm.
Whether they be capital, whether they be academia, whether they be government. I think we've done ourselves quite a disservice in sort of muddying the waters as to where those things belong. And of course, money is the roots of a lot of this evil in that regard. I mean, it's quite hard to stop the stuff from flowing. It's extraordinarily fungible, right? It just flows, it messes things up. But that's the point. You kind of got to guard these institutions that aren't natural. They're very unnatural. They were built by humans, for reasons, to protect us from ourselves and to protect ourselves from the temptations that we're all susceptible to falling into. We shouldn't sit here and make judgments upon people who have been tempted by large speaking fees and nice agents and book deals. I mean, those are very tempting things, in this world. And they're things that can seem innocent until you kind of see how they poison your ideas, even if they're not poisoning your actions. I mean, like corruption in the public sector is quite easy to spot. You paid money to give someone a tender deal, right? Like there was an exchange of money. But when it comes to the exchange of sort of celebrity that can then for later on be cashed into credit, it's a lot easier, it's a lot harder to check yourself, and it's a lot easier to fall into the trap of essentially becoming corrupted by the forces of this world. But that's something we kind of got to hold each other up to, in terms of holding each other up to accounts and to ethical standards. Certainly not easy, but sounds like you're doing a bit of that where you are. It doesn't make you popular either.
Doesn't make you popular, but I'm trying.
Nothing wrong with that. Thank you very much. Okay, I think I've taken up far too much of your time, and I've probably spoken far too much. If you have any sort of closing thoughts you want to wrap up there, any points you want to clarify, or anything you want to redact off the record, now is your chance. That's point number one. And point number two is, where can people find you if they want to shout at you or converse with you or pay you?
No mea culpa, but I will say you can find me on Twitter or X at Josh Gellers. My website's joshgellers.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, same name. So look forward to connecting.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
That's right. I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite an important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement. And that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting, and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy, and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate. So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.